something I had to go do. I don't really know the end result. All I know is I want to go to all the capitals. I want to look for the symbolism, and whatever I find, and I will find some sort of inspiration as I go.
Welcome to the Crossing It Off podcast, where each episode we share the stories of individuals that are living out their bucket/life goal list. I am your host, Roger Williams, and through hearing our guests' adventures, my goal is that you will find encouragement and empowerment to add and cross items off of your list. At this time, I'd like to welcome my guest for today. His name is Gary Flanagan. Gary's a retired guy living the dream of traveling and goes by the name of Thor with his grandchildren. Gary, thanks for being here today.
Oh, you're very welcome, Roger. My pleasure.
So tell us, what did you cross off your list?
Well, the one that we first connected on would be visiting all 51 state capitals.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
And so you say 51. Explain the one.
Okay. Well, Washington D.C. is a state. Well, it's a U.S. capital, so it counts as all 51 U.S. capitals. And I was looking for the closest church to every state capital, and it's a long story, but I was able to cross that off my list in 2013 within a 3-month period.
So the average person in the United States, is at least what I've read, is that they visit 12 states. Like that's the average number of states. What made so going to all 50, 51 is a huge thing, visiting all those capitals. What made you decide to do that? What crawl or in your brain to say, okay, I'm gonna go do this?
Yeah, well, the idea started back in 2001, really, about visiting all 50 states. And I was actually looking at a map of all the coins, the US coins, when they first came out with all the state things. And my goddaughter at the time said to me, "Uncle Gary, can you actually go to all 50 states?" And she was looking at this map. So I had a lot of background with routing, with USA Today, routing delivery routes, those type of things. So I said, yeah, sure, I could figure that out, right? So that actually started it in the summer of 2001. I got the family involved with it. 4 out of the 5 in the family were available for that summer. So I asked my boss for some time off, and we went out and we did all 50 states for that summer, from June through August.
You did this in one summer.
Yes, that was the first trip.
Wow.
Of course. Yeah, once you start doing 50 state trips, you're like, okay, well, that was fun.
How did you said you had some experience with routing. This is all by car, I'm assuming, except of course for maybe Alaska and Hawaii, this is like all driving?
Correct. All driving. We went out and I looked for vans, and I found a conversion van that would make it a little bit more comfortable for everybody. And we drove the 48, flew to Alaska and Hawaii in the summer of 2001.
And so what constitutes, I know there's some debate, at least online. I know there's debate on everything online, but there's debate online about what constitutes actually visiting a state if you're doing these kind of trips. So for that first trip that you did, what would you use as your base for actually visiting? Was it just driving through, or what was the criteria?
Well, it was driving through. We tried to do as many things as we could along the way. We knew people across the country because I was a big fan of Peter Frampton, and we had gone to some live shows. Almost all members of the family had a artist that they liked.
Oh, okay.
So we got to see some concerts along the way. Of course, we met people that we knew from across the country, but hadn't actually visited them in person. So we did some of that. And then landmarks that, we're all kind of interested in. And if we could get close enough to it and I could route close enough to it, we would do that. So it was literally a kind of day by day. I had a plan, but it didn't have to stick completely to the plan. And we got to see all kinds of stuff, glaciers in Alaska, um, um, Yellowstone, Old
Uh-huh.
Faithful, the Grand Canyon on the way back. I mean, just all kinds of things. And
And you
it
said
was,
that, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, it was free flowing, but with the kind of a rough plan that we had to accomplish it so that we could cross everything off. How to
Yeah.
get the state signs, those type of things.
Okay. All right. So so it was you and who else? You said three other
Yeah,
people?
my wife, my daughter, my youngest son were able to make that trip. My oldest son at the time was in college up in Maine, and he wasn't able to make the trip. But 2 years later, my oldest son and myself, we went on another 50-state trip for another reason. We did all 50 states in 8 days and 20 minutes.
That's Cannonball Runish right there.
It was. And the the reason we did that is because we had both read a book about this guy, Ron Ayers, who had ridden a motorcycle to 49 states in 7 days.
Wow.
He wrote a book about it called Against the Wind. And we had both happened to have read that, from Christmas on. I saw it, I gave it to him, and he was still in college in Maine. And the other thing that happened after we both read that book, there was this big fire in Rhode Island. You may have remembered it,
Mm-hmm.
at the Station nightclub. Great White was performing, and they lit off some flares, and
Yeah.
100 people died. That whole thing. So we lived in Rhode Island, and kind of Rhode Island. Everybody knows everybody in one, kind of a Kevin Bacon way. 6 degrees of separation.
Right.
So, I mean, it really hit home. We weren't at the fire, but being people that, a family that like to go to live concerts,
Right.
that kind of hit home. It could have been us just as easily. We weren't fans of Great White, but it was a local nightclub that, on any given night, if we were all around, we could go to that. Anyway, so that really hit home, and we decided to, hey, Ron Ayers did it in 49 states in 7 days on a motorcycle. Why not, us trying to do that, and maybe raise some money for the victims in that.
Wow, that's
And
awesome.
already had the conversion van, and Pete said, yeah, hey, one of us can sleep, one of us can drive.
Oh, wow.
Let's give it a shot. So we actually drove across the country. He had a summer break. He had maybe 3 weeks that he had a break on. So we drove across the country to Hyder, Alaska, which is the southernmost drivable point in Alaska, which is where Ron Ayers actually finished his trip, and said, okay, let's start. And we drove down to Seattle, flew over to Honolulu, literally, actually Maui, literally got off the airplane, walked through the lobby, got back in line to go back on the next plane, and then got to Seattle, and then drove the rest of the way. So we drove 49 states in that particular trip, and finished 8 days, 20 minutes later, which at the time, after I did some research, was the fastest anybody had ever done 50 states. It's been broken a number of times since.
Right. Yeah, they do call that the Cannonball, right? The Cannonball, that is the Cannonball.
Well, yeah, we didn't call it that at the time. We were just trying to raise some money, and hey, if that guy could do it in 49 states in 7 days on a motorcycle, why couldn't we? Right.
Right. Sure.
It was basically that kind of motivation. But after you did some research, then I really started researching the 50 state thing, as far as who's done it fastest, how many people have done it,
right,
that kind of thing. And like, hey, I got a trend going now. I've done 2 of these, and so I kind of put that in my pocket and said, one of these days, I'll probably do another one. What's the next big thing? To me, it would be capitals.
Okay.
Because the capitals are harder to route.
Right. I was just about to ask, what were some of the differences between those, actually just doing the trips and going to the capitals, and how did that change your timeframes and stuff?
Yeah, that completely changed it, because when I decided to go to the capitals, I had no time frame as to when I was going to do it. Mm-hmm. And at the time, we lived in Rhode Island. About 10 years passed from 2003 to 2013 when I decided to do the capitals. We had moved to Tennessee, And I worked for USA Today for many years in circulation, to designing routes, delivery
Hmm.
routes, things like that. And they let me go in January of 2013, and just kind of like, yep, bye, it's
Yeah.
time. There was a big layoff. A lot of people got laid off, but they gave me what they call a separation package.
Hmm.
I had 22 years of experience, so they gave me 22 weeks of, you know,
Not
uh,
bad.
yeah, it wasn't bad. So I'm like, well, what am I going to do with this? Um, so, it was one of those packages that if you got a job in the meantime, the package would stop, you know. So I was kind of, just looking around, and I woke up one morning with the idea of separation of church and state in my head. And
Mm.
like, go ahead and Google it, figure out what it really is. I really hadn't done any research. I had no real past history of looking at church or political or anything like that. But I woke up and I said, what's this about? And literally, I said, I'm going to go to Google and type
Hmm.
in separation of church and state. And it popped up two names. Um, Thomas Jefferson was the first one, and Roger Williams. Not you.
Not
I
me.
don't think. Maybe you've done some other stuff. I don't know. But Roger Williams was the second name. And I went, huh.
So
Um,
Roger Williams' connection to your time in Rhode Island.
yes,
Uh-huh.
exactly. And the strange thing was, they really didn't teach much about Roger Williams, even though he was the founder of Rhode Island,
Right.
going through school. So I said, well, okay, let's dig a little deeper. And I dug deeper, and I looked at the two statements that both of them had made that kind of led to that metaphor being developed, Thomas Jefferson and Roger Williams. And Thomas Jefferson talks about walls of separation, and it was, a letter from the Baptists when he first became president. He was responding to it.
Right.
Then I looked, and people said, well, Roger Williams actually did this before Thomas Jefferson did. He had a letter that he was responding to a colleague, or someone he was always arguing with back in the day in the 1600s in Boston. And he basically used that same metaphor in, the words of the day.
Right.
Very eloquent, of course, and a lot of words, but talking about a hedge or a wall of separation between what he called the garden of the God and the wilderness of the world.
Mm.
And I looked at that and I went, hedge, wall of separation. And the strangest thing happened. I was like, well, I lived in Rhode Island. I delivered all over Rhode Island. I know Rhode Island. I know the State House. Wait a minute. There is a wall and a hedge running down the left side of the State House that separates, they actually have a garden of heroes and churches around it. I'm like,
Yeah.
isn't that strange? Is that really symbolism? And then I thought about the First Baptist Church in America that Roger Williams had founded, which is only about a mile away on the hill coming down from Brown University. And sure enough, there's a hedge going around that
Mhm.
church. Now, hedges are fairly common, right?
Sure.
But that at that point, it said to me, hedges, walls, church symbolism. I wonder if this is intentional, or can I find this anywhere else? And since I had already done two 50-state trips, I was like, what's my next one going to be? I just had the separation, and it all came together. I'm like, I'm going to go to all the capitals. I'm going to look for the closest church to each capital, and I'm going to just photograph it, write down about it, figure it out, research it, and just see what I find,
And so
and
what
see if
did
there is truly symbolism.
yeah, and
Uh,
what did you find when you traveled around
all kinds of things. The first, at the time, that was March, and I lived in Tennessee. I'm like, oh, okay, now I'm going to do this. How am I going to figure this out? And I literally had it kind of like, I'm going to start in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
because it was March. There was actually a big storm going across the north at the time. And I'm like, well, I don't really want to go play in the snow too much. So
Mm-hmm.
I said, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. and just see what I find, and then start heading south and go state by state. And I don't know how long this is going to last. I literally told my wife, Marie, I'm like, I just got to go do this. It
Yeah.
was just something I had to go do. I don't really know the end result. All I know is I want to go to all the capitals. I want to look for this symbolism, and whatever I find, and I will find some sort of inspiration as I go.
Sure.
And that's what I did. I started in Washington, D.C., and literally, I just walked to the back of the Capitol, drove to the back of the Capitol. And it was early in the morning. It was like 4 or 5 o'clock, because that's the easiest way to get in and out.
Mhm.
You don't really want to play Washington, D.C. traffic
No.
unless you have to. So I started looking around, and right behind the Capitol is, of course, the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress.
Mhm.
Library of Congress is called the Jefferson Building. Okay, first connection right there. Symbolism, maybe, right? If you walk down between the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress, and you walk down that neighborhood back there, as I started walking around and just driving around a little bit, there's 7 churches sitting there. 7 different churches, 7 different faiths. Lutheran is the first one. There was a Catholic, St. Joseph, where Robert F. Kennedy was, laid out and all that. Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist. I mean, they're all there. And it's like this, they're all kind of clustered behind the Capitol. I'm like, well, to me, that's symbolism. That's
Right.
kind of almost the same thing I saw up in Rhode Island, just in a different way. I'm like, oh, this could be fun. So I literally then drove over to the Jefferson Memorial, took a bunch of pictures there, and started reading, the words of Jefferson, and some of it connects the symbolism. Washington, D.C. is just amazing with symbolism.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It was designed to have the largest home field advantage ever. So, and I think it accomplishes that in most,
Absolutely.
capitals from around the world. It's very, very intimidating. Even though,
yes, and a lot of these cities turned out to be somewhat intimidating because I had never been to them in those cities before. So basically, I drove from there. I went down to Richmond, Virginia, which Jefferson again. He designed that Capitol.
right.
When I got there and I looked across the street, there was a Baptist church literally within the same site frame, a beautiful Baptist church. So I chronicled that, and I'm like, well, I'll figure this out later as I go along. I went to South Carolina and Georgia and just started taking pictures, not really knowing how I was going to connect it all, other than that's the next state to go to.
Right. And so how many states did you accomplish in that first trip? Did you get all of them? Or
First trip, I got about 20 of them. Basically, I went across the South, came up through Arizona, up the Rocky Mountains to Utah, Idaho, Montana, came back down the other side of the Rockies into Wyoming, Colorado, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then started back east, Oklahoma City, up to Jefferson City, Missouri, down to Arkansas, and then Mississippi, back into Tennessee, Nashville, which was my last stop before I at that point I was running out of a little bit of money and just motivation. I had to get back home to my family.
Sure.
But there was a number of spots along the way that were very interesting that really decided how the rest of the trip was going to go. I started running across, and it's much longer story for another time, but started running across images and kind of symbols from my mom, who had passed 33 years earlier. And in fact, when I got to Oklahoma City, that was on the anniversary of the day that she had passed through 33 years earlier.
Wow.
And had a whole experience there that was even beyond church and state thing. But it was because I went to go look for a church that was closest to the Capitol that I ran across this person that really interacted. And I actually write about it in my website, thorflanagan.com, which actually has a little article about each one of these state capitals with the churches next to it, and kind of what I found along the way.
What was the one capital or one church that what was the one experience or one state that most impacted you as far as how you felt about the trip when it was over?
Well, it was clearly Oklahoma City, because of the connection to my mom and when she passed, and it's actually stayed with me, and it turned into a number of other stories
Mhm.
that I write about from time to time. But
Was
that
there,
one, and that was, I could not predict that one.
okay.
I could have
That's
never predicted it.
okay. Well, then I was good. Well, that answers my next question. I was going to ask which one surprised you the most. Okay, I'll ask you your opinion. What's the most beautiful state capital and church combination out of all the states?
Oh, now that is tough.
Mhm.
Well, for different reasons, but Alaska is very interesting
Interesting. Hmm.
because, well, it's Juneau, Alaska, which is
Mhm.
interesting by itself. You can only fly into it or ride a cruise ship into it.
Right.
You can't drive because the glaciers completely surround where it's located. So I was looking forward to just getting there anyway. I'd never been to Juneau. Um, and the building, the Capitol building for Alaska there, it's just a big brick building.
Mm.
Nothing outstanding about it. And in fact, when I was there, there's construction cranes and all that in front of it, kind of digging up the ground in front of it. And it sits up on a hill. You come up from the harbor and it sits up on a hill, and you'd miss it if you really didn't know what you were looking for.
Mm.
But behind it, 1 block to the east is the Russian Orthodox
Mm.
Church. And it's a beautiful church, beautiful, small little church. And that juxtaposition of the two of them
Uh-huh.
is really kind of special. And then later on, I ended up writing about, had to do research on them, because after I finished the trip, and about a year later, I actually worked with a local newspaper, the Tennessee Star at the time, and just doing some distribution work with him. And after telling him some of my stories, he said, "Hey, you should write some articles about this, And I had never written any articles. I was just the circulation guy at USA.
Right.
Everybody would always ask me, "Are you a writer?" And no, not at all. But he said, "You should write some articles." So when I started writing articles for it, I had to do a little more research. Once I had all that data, okay, this is the closest church. This is, the capital. How did they get there?
Right.
Which one came first, the chicken or the egg, right? This church or that church. So when I started researching that, I would write an article on it, and he told me to keep it to generally 500 words, which is a challenge.
Sure.
But that's how I learned more about it. So that dive has just continued ever since.
If someone's listening to you right now about this and says, "Okay, I want to do that," what would be like, or I'm not sure I want to do that, what would be like the one thing that you would tell them, the reason why you should visit all 50 state capitals in the nearest church? What would be the reason for somebody else to do that trip?
Mhm. Well, that answer actually just came to me probably about a month ago,
Hmm.
when I was back in Rhode Island visiting family and all that. And I happened to, Roger Williams National Memorial is right down the hill from the Capitol.
Mhm.
And I had never even known it was there, of course, until even like 3 or 4 years after I did this trip. But on one of the trips back, as it's the rabbit hole. You just keep going deeper and deeper. Anyway, I got to the National Memorial. I've been there a couple times, but this time a month ago when I went by there was a park ranger there, and he was the only one in there. And we started discussing Roger Williams and his search for truth and his search for understanding of, all kinds of things, but
Right.
religion and the freedom of liberty. And as we started comparing notes of what I had found over time and what he had found, just being the ranger in that facility, he goes, the real story about Roger Williams is that it's the seeker. It's
Mm.
the one just going and, trying to understand things, but being okay with not understanding them. it's
Mhm.
that, you know, find something that's interesting. And in the journey, of course, like everybody knows, the journey is more important than the destination many
Right.
times, right? So it's that journey, and it's the looking and the finding and what you find along the way that will totally surprise you, and also plug in your pieces of whatever puzzle you're chasing. So, if you want to know more about the separation of church and state, to me, you really need to dig into it and not get caught on either side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So often now we have to be right.
Well, it's a tough one to get to, because I think that's what the ranger and I were trying to get to. And he says, you're trying to learn, trying to understand, but you have to be okay with not having to get that final understanding. And that's really the beauty of it.
Yeah.
So, if you get into Roger Williams at all, which I've done a lot more since, that's a fascinating study on how he came over from England and how he was preaching in Boston, and they basically kicked him out because he was too many dangerous opinions.
Yeah. Well, it's too accepting.
Yeah.
Gary, what's the next thing you want to cross off your list? Is it another 50 stater, or is there something else? What's the next thing you want to cross off?
Well, yeah. I'm currently working on visiting all the state capitals, which includes all the previous state capitals. I started this just about this time last year. And I'd done another 50 state, I guess, blitz run in 2019. I did a solo trip trying to actually break some of the records that had been broken since I came home. And I guess the solo trip is a guy by the name of Barry. I can't think of his last name now. But anyway, Barry with the Extra Miler Club, he had done in, I think, 1998, he had gone to all 50 states in 8 days and like 16 hours, something like that, solo. Crazy. So I tried to do that, and I didn't quite do that, but I did it in 9 days in 2019. So last year, I'm looking through Wikipedia, believe it or not, and just Googling different little things. And I said, let me state capitals. Let me just see what they got. And it pops up, and it actually shows that when I counted them all up, 101 state capital.
Because they switched locations. That's what basically what.
Right. And very much like in the East Coast, you find some states that have had as many as 8, Georgia. And that one really fascinated me, because I was getting ready to go to Florida just about a year ago. And I'm doing that again this weekend. I have family down in Florida, and then this other little business I do, they have a convention in Orlando. Now I'm going through Georgia, and I'm like, they have 8 state capitals.
Wow.
And I'm like, what's that all about? So I just dug into it. And so I said, I'm going to go to all 8 state capitals, wherever they are, and just see what I find. So I did that in like a day and a half. And just, once again, more stories, more interesting things. There's 2 of them that basically don't even exist anymore. They're just willows in a cemetery out in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
And so I started on this journey, and I said, well, I'm going to take my time doing this one. But my goal is to get to all 101 state capitals. Some of them I've been to, obviously the current ones, I've been to all of those, but all the previous ones, I'm going to dig into it. So I started doing that. I've gotten up to 63 so far. And I was hoping to do them all in last year, but basically I'm just kind of doing it on weekends. And when I get an extra week that, not committed to anything else, my wife's still working. She still has about another year to go before she retires. So as time allows, I've been chasing down. So I found all kinds of cool things about some of these other capitals.
Is there anything on your list that is different than doing 50 states? Do you have something on your list that's like completely opposite of that or different than that?
Well, it would be what we're doing today, actually. I hadn't even thought about it until I'm like, I've never been on a podcast. I've never thought about running my own. People tell me I should run my own podcast because I have all these stories, but I've never really seriously looked at it,
I would listen to that podcast. If it was about people in their 50 state travels, I would, interviewing different people doing it. I would definitely be interested in listening to that podcast. I actually only have 2 more states left, and I'm going to be done with my list. So I have Alaska and North Dakota left. So I think this summer I'm going to just bite the bullet and go and visit both those in the same weekend and get it done with. So.
Yeah, well, that could be a little difficult. Alaska and North Dakota is actually, I also belong to this club called the All 50 State Club, run by Alicia Rovey out near Nashville. And she gives you certificates and all kinds of stories. She has a Facebook page, and they have their own website too. And it tells about all the stories on how different people do different themes. So it's very interesting. She's great person. And then I'm also involved with the Extra Miler Club, which is the club that actually tries to go to all the counties in the United States.
Oh my gosh.
It's 3,142. There's only been like 20 or 30 people that have actually done it. So I'm on that journey as well. I think I'm almost to 2,000 counties out of 3,142. You would think a guy that's done 4 50-state trips would have more, but it doesn't play out that way, because Extra Miler, you really have to go to some really extremes to get to some of these counties in some of these states. So.
That's awesome. Gary, tell us how we can get more information about you and your trips. You said you had a website. Could you repeat that? And I'll make sure I link it in the show notes as this gets released.
Sure. ThorFlanagan.com. So ThorFlanagan.com.
Awesome. This is awesome.
Yes.
Gary, thank you so much for coming and being on the show. You did a great job for your first time. And I'm sure that you'll get lots of other chances to tell your stories. And I wish you all the success in getting all those state capitals, the 101 you said. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome, Roger. I hope to see you in North Dakota and Alaska.
As a reminder to our listeners, in this episode's show notes, you will find links to learn more about this week's guest and information on how you can cross this item off of your list. You can follow my adventures of crossing items off my bucket list on Instagram and Facebook. And as always, new episodes of this podcast are available to stream every Friday morning. We will meet you here next week. And until then, keep living out your list.